The night was thick with fog as Emily stepped onto the creaking platform of the ghost train. The faint glow of flickering lanterns barely pierced the heavy mist that clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. The train itself loomed before her, a hulking relic from another time, its rusted metal frame groaning as if in protest. The windows were dark, save for a few dim lights that flickered weakly inside, casting eerie shadows across the cracked seats. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine, the cold air biting at her skin, but there was something else, something deeper that unsettled her, a presence, unseen yet undeniable. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming for her to turn back, but the allure of the unknown pulled her forward. As the train jolted into motion, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on old tracks echoed through the narrow carriage. The other passengers seemed oblivious to the creeping dread, chatting softly, their voices strangely muted as if the very air was absorbing their sound. Emily's gaze wandered out the window, but all she could see was the dense blackness of the night. A faint hum buzzed in her ears, almost like a distant whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. The train picked up speed, and the familiar landscape outside began to blur, replaced by an unnerving emptiness. Her fingers gripped the worn leather seat tightly, and a knot of unease twisted in her stomach. It was then that she noticed it, a figure standing at the far end of the carriage, cloaked in shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence was palpable, pressing down on the atmosphere like a suffocating weight. Emily blinked, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks on her in the dim light, but when she opened her eyes, the figure was still there, closer now. Panic surged through her veins, and she glanced around, expecting others to react, to see what she saw. But no one else seemed to notice. Her heartbeat quickened as a wave of cold air swept through the train, making her breath mist in front of her face. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and for a brief moment, they went out completely. When they came back on, the figure was gone. Relief washed over her for a second, but it was short-lived. A strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck, like she was being watched. She turned slowly toward the window, and there, reflected in the glass, was the face of a man, pale, sunken eyes staring directly at her. She gasped, spinning around, but the seat behind her was empty. The face was gone, leaving only the faintest fog of breath on the cold glass. The train roared into a long dark tunnel, the outside world swallowed by shadows. The passengers fell silent, and Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. The sense of being hunted, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger with every passing second. She knew with a terrifying certainty that she was no longer alone on this ride. As the train plunged deeper into the pitch-black tunnel, Emily's mind raced, grasping for answers, for some way to make sense of the creeping dread that clung to her. The walls outside the windows seemed to close in, the clattering of the tracks becoming an oppressive rhythm that echoed inside her skull. But then, amidst the overwhelming darkness, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought of in years. It was a hot summer evening from her childhood, when she had stayed with her grandmother in a small town not far from these very tracks. There was a story her grandmother used to tell her, a tale meant to scare children away from the old abandoned railway that cut through the forest. The locals called it the Phantom Line, and it was said that the souls of those who had died in the many accidents along the tracks still wandered the area, lost in the fog of time. Emily had dismissed it as just another ghost story back then, but now, the weight of those words seemed heavier. She remembered one night in particular, when she and a friend had dared each other to walk along the tracks. It was supposed to be a harmless thrill, but something strange happened that night. As they neared an old crossing, Emily had seen a shadow, a figure tall and gaunt, moving alongside the tracks, just beyond the trees. She had called out to her friend, but the figure vanished before they could both see it. That moment had been seared into her mind, but she had pushed it deep down, convincing herself it was a trick of the light or her imagination playing games in the dark. Now the terror she had felt back then clawed its way back to the surface. Sitting in the dimly lit train, she felt that same suffocating sense of fear creeping over her, as if the past was folding in on the present. The carriage was unnervingly quiet now, the other passengers seemingly oblivious to the tension in the air. Emily tried to shake the memory from her thoughts, but it clung to her like a shadow. Her grandmother had always been cryptic about the old stories, warning her never to linger near the tracks after dark. Emily thought of her grandmother's old house, the musty scent of the attic, and the boxes of forgotten relics stored away. Among them was a small music box, something Emily hadn't thought about in years. It had played a haunting melody, one that seemed to resonate with the very air of that old town. And then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the soft lilting notes of that same melody began to play. Faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the hum of the train's wheels, but unmistakable. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head sharply, looking for the source, but there was nothing, just the empty seats and the oppressive darkness pressing against the windows. The music grew louder, filling the carriage, a melancholic tune that sent chills racing down her spine. The air grew colder, and her breath fogged up the glass. Emily's mind reeled. How could this be happening? That music box had been locked away for years, and yet the eerie, nostalgic tune was unmistakable. Suddenly, a flash of memory hit her like a wave. The night after she and her friend had seen the figure by the tracks, the music box had played by itself, in the dead of night. She had woken to the sound, her bedroom bathed in the pale glow of the moon, and there, sitting on her dresser, was the music box, slowly turning on its own. She had never told anyone about it, chalking it up to a nightmare. But now, in the stifling atmosphere of the ghost train, the walls between past and present felt paper-thin. Emily gripped the edge of her seat, the melody swirling around her, growing louder and more distorted, as if the very train itself was mocking her with the echoes of her forgotten past. And then she saw it, the reflection in the window once again. But this time, it wasn't a face. It was the music box, sitting on a dusty, cobweb-covered shelf, just behind her reflection, as if it had always been there waiting. Emily's pulse raced, her throat tightening as she slowly turned her head to look behind her. The seat was empty, the shelf bare. Yet, the music played on, relentless, pulling her back to that summer night, pulling her deeper into the dark heart of the Phantom Line's cursed history. She was trapped, not just on this train, but in a nightmare that had started long ago, and she had no idea how it would end. The train's rhythmic clatter slowed, and with it, Emily felt the weight of an impending decision pressing down on her chest like a vice. The air grew heavier, colder, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to warp around her, distorting reality itself. The haunting melody of the music box faded into the background, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that slithered through the cracks in the walls of the carriage. It wasn't coming from any one place, it was everywhere, seeping into her mind. The voice was ancient, filled with malice, and it called her by name. "Emily," it rasped, sending a shiver through her bones. The other passengers sat motionless, their faces blank, as if they were no longer even there. She was utterly alone with whatever was speaking to her from the shadows. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt, throwing Emily forward in her seat. The lights flickered violently before plunging the entire carriage into pitch-black darkness. For a moment, there was only silence, deep, suffocating silence. Then slowly, a single dim light flickered on, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. In the weak glow, Emily saw something she hadn't noticed before: a door at the far end of the carriage, old and weathered, as though it had been there for centuries. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing nothing but an inky void beyond. The whispering grew louder, filling her head with thoughts that weren't her own, images of things she didn't understand, faces of the dead, places long forgotten, and a darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. And then came the voice again, clear and insidious, offering her a choice. "You can leave, Emily, but not without a price." Her pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She could feel the presence of something beyond that door, waiting for her, calling to her. But the voice's offer came with a chilling ultimatum. She could escape this nightmare, but she had to give up something precious, one of her most cherished memories. The idea seemed impossible, cruel even. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. Her most cherished memory? Her mind instantly drifted to the memory of her mother, long since passed, holding her hand on a warm summer day, the two of them laughing as they wandered through fields of wildflowers. It was a memory that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her life, a piece of her heart she could never part with. The very thought of losing it was unbearable. But then the voice hissed again, more insistent now. "The longer you wait, the more you will lose." Panic surged through her. What was she to do? The train seemed to close in on her, the shadows creeping closer with every passing second. She felt as though she was sinking into the floor, the weight of the decision crushing her spirit. Her mind scrambled for alternatives, but there were none. The spirits that haunted this train, the entity that controlled it, they demanded a sacrifice. And if she didn't choose soon, she had no doubt the consequences would be far worse than the loss of a memory. The air was thick with malevolence, and she could feel eyes watching her from the darkness, waiting, hungering for her decision. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white. What would happen if she refused? Would she be trapped here forever, lost in the train's endless, cursed journey, like the other passengers who now seemed more like empty husks than living people? Could she live with herself if she gave up that memory, the one pure piece of her past, just to save herself? But what choice did she have? The voice had already told her the price, and now it was up to her to decide whether her survival was worth the cost of losing a part of herself forever. Emily's heart pounded, her breath shallow and quick. She knew she was running out of time. The door loomed ahead, the dark void beyond it pulsating as if alive, waiting to consume her. She closed her eyes, tears welling up as she clutched the memory of her mother tighter in her mind. Could she really let it go? The voice, cold and relentless, whispered one last time, "Choose, or be chosen." With a sob, Emily made her decision. She whispered into the dark, "Take it." The moment the words left her lips, the air in the carriage shifted, the cold dissipating for just a second as the dark entity accepted her sacrifice. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest, and the memory of her mother, the wildflowers, her laughter, the warmth of her hand, faded from her mind, like smoke dissolving into the air. She gasped, feeling the loss hit her like a punch to the gut, her heart breaking as the last remnants of that beautiful day vanished forever. The door creaked open wider, revealing a way out. But as Emily stood on shaky legs, ready to flee, she couldn't help but feel that she had lost more than just a memory. The darkness had taken something far deeper, and now, as she stepped toward the door, the shadows seemed to cling to her, whispering promises that the terror was far from over. As Emily stepped through the creaking door, a biting cold enveloped her, so sharp it felt like it cut through her very soul. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, leaving her stranded in an endless corridor bathed in faint, flickering light. The walls were old, crumbling, as if time itself had been forgotten in this forsaken place. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, each sound drawn out, distorted, as though the very walls were swallowing the noise. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually growing louder. It wasn't just noise, it was voices whispering, murmuring her name in tones so soft they made her skin crawl. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and breathing, as if the shadows were watching her every move. Emily's breath quickened, each inhalation shallow as the whispers grew closer, slithering through the air like serpents. She felt something brush against her arm, cold, soft, like a fleeting caress of death itself. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding her, tugging at the edges of her mind. They weren't just sounds, they were thoughts, invasive and insidious, creeping into her head. "You made a choice," they hissed, the voices blending together into a sickening harmony. "Now you must face the consequences." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of fear crushing her ribs. She knew she wasn't alone in this corridor, but whatever was with her was hiding, waiting in the spaces between the shadows. Her eyes darted to every corner, but the darkness concealed whatever lurked within. Suddenly, the walls groaned, shifting like old wood under pressure, and the flickering lights began to dim. The corridor stretched impossibly long before her, as though it were expanding into infinity. Her footsteps slowed, her legs heavy with dread. It was as if the very air was conspiring against her, pressing down on her, thick and suffocating. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, Emily thought it was her own heartbeat, but it grew louder, closer, as though something was walking toward her from deep within the shadows. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, a steady cadence that sent shivers down her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror that gripped her. She could feel it now, whatever was approaching her, it wasn't human. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, as though warning her, or perhaps mocking her fear. "He's coming," they chanted in a twisted sing-song voice. "He's been waiting for you." The tapping stopped. Silence. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw movement. A figure emerged from the shadow at the end of the corridor. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and grotesque, like something pulled from a nightmare. Its face, or what should have been a face, was obscured by darkness, but Emily could feel its gaze boring into her, cold and empty. She backed away instinctively, but the corridor seemed to stretch further with each step she took, trapping her in its endless loop. The figure began to move, its footsteps unervingly slow, each one echoing louder than the last. The whispers crescendoed into a chaotic storm in her mind, twisting her thoughts, feeding on her growing panic. Emily's vision blurred as the oppressive darkness seemed to warp around her, distorting reality itself. The walls groaned again, and this time they shifted, literally moved, as if the corridor were collapsing inward. The air grew impossibly thick, and the flickering lights sputtered, casting strange jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, Emily realized that the shadows were not merely tricks of the light. They were alive, crawling along the walls like insects, inching closer to her. She could hear them now, their whispered words twisting into her ears, speaking of her past, her regrets, her fears. Her legs finally moved, driven by sheer survival instinct, and she bolted down the corridor. But no matter how fast she ran, the end of the hallway never seemed to get any closer. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her ears. The tapping resumed behind her, faster now, as though whatever was following her had begun to give chase. She didn't dare look back, she couldn't. The weight of whatever was behind her was suffocating, like a dark force that would consume her if she even glanced in its direction. Then the whispers shifted, no longer outside her mind but within it. They clawed at her thoughts, twisting her memories, her sense of self. "You made a choice," they repeated. "You gave up a piece of your soul." The words sent a cold wave of horror through her. Emily stumbled, the weight of their meaning pressing down on her. She had sacrificed her most precious memory, but in doing so, had opened a door to something far darker, something that now had a claim on her. The shadows closed in, their whispers becoming deafening, almost a scream. And then, in the deepest recesses of her mind, she heard it, a voice soft, almost a whisper among whispers. "Run, Emily, run. But you can't run forever." Her feet faltered, and for a split second, she dared to glance back. What she saw made her blood run cold. The tall figure was closer, its twisted form distorted by the shadows. Its face, now fully visible, was a reflection of her own, pale and hollow, eyes black and endless like the void. The tapping echoed louder now, almost a heartbeat in rhythm with her own. Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the corridor, devoured by the shadows that danced around her like predators circling their prey. She was trapped in their grasp, caught between the darkness and the void, and there was no escape. The corridor stretched on forever, a nightmare with no end, and in the heart of it, Emily realized that this was her punishment, an endless run from the shadows of her past, chased by a fear she could never outrun. The corridor twisted unnaturally as Emily ran, her vision blurring at the edges, the shadows seeming to pulse and breathe around her. Each step she took was heavier than the last, as if the very air had thickened into something tangible, pressing against her, slowing her down. Her mind was reeling, a chaotic storm of fear and confusion, and yet, something more sinister was beginning to creep into her thoughts. It wasn't just the terror of being chased by the grotesque figure, it was the growing sense that her own mind was turning against her. The shadows seemed to whisper to her, not just in words, but in thoughts, twisting her perceptions, making her question everything she knew about reality. "What is real?" they whispered. "Are you sure this isn't all in your head?" As the whispers grew louder, Emily's vision began to distort further. The walls of the corridor started to bend and warp, the flickering lights casting long, monstrous shadows that stretched toward her. Her footsteps faltered as she glanced to her right and saw her reflection in one of the cracked windows that lined the wall. But it wasn't her. The figure staring back at her had her face, but its eyes were hollow, black pits of nothingness, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Emily gasped, stumbling backward as the reflection seemed to move on its own, pressing its pale hands against the glass as if trying to break free. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice layered with malice. "Not from yourself." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She knew that what she was seeing couldn't be real, yet it felt so vivid, so disturbingly tangible. The corridor began to ripple, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart around her. Her heart raced as she forced herself to keep moving, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But with each step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just taunting her anymore, they were offering something. "Give in to the fear," they cooed. "It's easier that way." The temptation was there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and the idea of surrendering to it was becoming increasingly seductive. The shadows around her seemed to react to her thoughts, shifting and twisting in time with the growing fear inside her. As she ran, the walls of the corridor closed in, narrowing, making it harder and harder to breathe. Emily could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her legs growing weaker with every step. Her mind was slipping, the boundaries between what was real and what was a hallucination blurring beyond recognition. And then in the distance she saw something, an open door, bathed in a faint golden light. It was an escape, a way out of this nightmare. But the whispers returned, cold and invasive, warning her, tempting her. "You don't want to leave," they hissed. "What's waiting for you out there is worse than what's in here." Emily's thoughts swirled in confusion. Was it possible? Could what awaited beyond the door be even more terrifying than what she was enduring now? The fear gnawed at her mind, twisting her perception. She slowed, her eyes locked on the golden light. What if this was another trick? What if the shadows were right, and leaving the safety of the corridor would lead to something far worse? Her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the cold, damp wall, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She could feel the dark presence of the entity behind her, drawing closer, but even that fear paled in comparison to the growing terror within her own mind. "You can't fight it," the whispers said. "You never could." The shadows around her began to shift, twisting into familiar shapes, faces from her past, people she had loved and lost, but they were wrong, distorted. Her mother's face appeared, but her eyes were empty, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain. "Stay," the figure of her mother said, her voice a haunting echo. "It's safer here with us." Emily's chest tightened, her mind reeling from the onslaught of memories and fears that weren't her own. She felt her grip on reality slipping further, the line between her thoughts and the whispers blurring into one. Suddenly, the figure of her mother vanished, replaced by another reflection, this time of herself. The twisted version of her stared back with a cold, predatory smile. "You're afraid," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Afraid of what's inside you." The reflection stepped out from the wall, its form dark and smoky, yet solid. It circled her slowly, its eyes gleaming with twisted delight. "You've always been afraid, Emily. That's why you're here. That's why you'll never leave." The figure leaned in closer, its breath icy against her skin. "Because deep down you want this. You crave the fear. You need it." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers around her. But the reflection's smile only widened, a grotesque mockery of her fear. "You can't lie to yourself," it hissed. "Fear is the only thing that's real. The only thing that will always be with you." The figure's hand reached out, cold fingers brushing against Emily's cheek. She recoiled, her skin crawling at the touch, but the figure only laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the corridor. The shadows thickened around her, swirling like a storm, and Emily could feel the fear consuming her, pulling her under like a dark, endless tide. She could barely think, barely breathe. The door with the golden light seemed so far away now, and the whispers continued their relentless assault. "Give in," they urged. "Let it take you." Emily's mind screamed in resistance, but the weight of the fear was crushing her, suffocating her, making it impossible to see any way out. The temptation to surrender, to let the darkness consume her, was almost overwhelming. And then, in the midst of the swirling terror, a thought flickered through her mind, small but defiant. "What if I don't give in?" The question cut through the fog of fear like a knife, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Emily could see clearly. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if startled by her sudden resolve. The whispers faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Emily pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling, but she forced herself to take a step forward. The figure of her reflection sneered, but its form was flickering now, unstable. "You can't escape," it hissed one last time, but Emily ignored it. With a final shaky breath, she turned away from the reflection and ran toward the door, the golden light growing brighter with every step. The shadows screamed around her, the whispers turning into a deafening roar, but Emily kept moving. She knew that if she stopped, if she gave in, she would be lost forever in the darkness. And as she reached the threshold of the door, the shadows lunged at her one last time, but she burst through, her body breaking free from the suffocating grasp of the fear that had threatened to consume her. Emily crashed through the door, her body propelled by sheer instinct, only to find herself in a vast, open space that seemed both infinite and claustrophobic at the same time. The golden light that had beckoned her moments before was gone, replaced by an eerie half-light that cast everything in a sickly pale glow. The air was dense, heavy with a sense of dread that made it difficult to breathe. Her legs shook beneath her as she stood, taking in her surroundings. The walls of the space seemed to pulse, as if alive, and the distant whispers that had tormented her earlier returned, only now they were louder, more insistent. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in shadow, its form barely distinguishable but undeniably human in shape. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized who, or rather what, it was. This was the entity that had been haunting her, the force behind the twisted reality she'd been trapped in. The realization sent a wave of terror washing over her, but she forced herself to stand still, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the figure ahead. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shift and warp, as if reality itself was bending to its will. Emily could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her, pulling at her mind, trying to draw her into the same abyss she had barely escaped. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but something in the air, something primal and ancient, kept her rooted to the spot. This wasn't just a random encounter. She was meant to face this creature. The truth of her situation, whatever it was, lay with this figure, and it was waiting for her. Then, without warning, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the shadows and into the faint light. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was her. Or, at least, it looked like her. The figure had her face, her posture, even her clothes, but there was something horribly wrong. Its eyes were black, bottomless voids, and its expression was twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. This was no reflection. It was a dark, warped version of herself, a mirror of the worst parts of her soul. The entity, this doppelganger, stood still, its gaze fixed on her, radiating malice. "You know why you're here," the doppelganger said, its voice a distorted echo of Emily's own, layered with a sinister undertone that sent chills through her. "You've always known." The words struck her like a physical blow, sending a surge of fear through her veins. She had known deep down from the moment she stepped onto the ghost train, that this journey wasn't just about escaping the supernatural. It was about facing something far more personal, something dark that she had buried long ago. Emily took a shaky step forward, her eyes never leaving the doppelganger. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the weight of the air around her was trying to silence her. The doppelganger's smile widened, a grotesque parody of her own fear. "It's not about what I want," it said, taking a slow step toward her. "It's about what you need. You've been running from it for so long, but it's always been inside you, growing, feeding on your fear." Emily's pulse quickened as the truth began to dawn on her. This wasn't just a ghost or some malevolent spirit haunting the train. This was a part of her, a dark, twisted part of herself that she had been running from all her life. Every fear, every doubt, every buried trauma had taken shape in this entity, and now it stood before her, demanding acknowledgement. She had tried to forget, to push the darkness down, but it had only grown stronger in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she could no longer escape. The doppelganger took another step closer, its black eyes narrowing. "You've made choices, Emily. Bad ones. And you've buried them, hoping they'd disappear. But nothing stays buried forever." The words hit her like a slap in the face, bringing with them a flood of memories she had long tried to forget, memories of guilt, of shame, of moments when she had hurt the people she loved. She had never faced those memories, never accepted responsibility for the choices she had made. And now, they had manifested into this dark, twisted version of herself, demanding that she confront them. Emily's legs trembled, her heart pounding in her chest. The doppelganger was right. She had been running from her past for far too long, and now it had caught up with her. But the fear that gripped her wasn't just about facing her mistakes, it was about what would happen if she didn't. The entity wasn't here to punish her. It was here to devour her. If she didn't face her darkness, if she didn't accept the truth, she would be consumed by it, lost to the shadows forever. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Emily took a step forward, closing the distance between her and the doppelganger. "I know what you are," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The doppelganger tilted its head, its smile faltering slightly. "Do you though?" it whispered, its voice like nails on glass. "Do you really understand what you've done?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a moment, Emily hesitated, but then she forced herself to remember. The choices she had made, the pain she had caused, they were all part of her, and she couldn't run from them any longer. "I do," she said, her voice firm. "I made mistakes. I hurt people. But I'm not afraid of you anymore." The doppelganger's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unbridled rage. Its black eyes flashed with hatred, and for a moment, Emily thought it might attack her. But instead, the figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into swirling shadows. The air around Emily grew cold, and the shadows closed in, tightening like a vice. But she stood her ground, refusing to let the fear take hold. The doppelganger's voice echoed through the darkness one last time, a twisted whisper. "This isn't over, Emily. You can never escape yourself." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The space around her was empty now, silent save for the faint hum of the train in the distance. She had faced her darkness, but the terror lingered, like a shadow that would never fully leave her. She knew the entity was right. She could never fully escape her past, but she had confronted it. And that, at least, gave her a fighting chance. The oppressive silence that followed the entity's departure weighed heavily on Emily. The vast, shadow-filled space around her felt alive with a dormant menace, like something was waiting, watching, preparing for the moment to strike. She stood slowly, her legs trembling, but her resolve firmer than before. The confrontation with the doppelganger had shaken her, but it had also left her with a grim understanding. This nightmare wasn't over, not yet. There was still something more, something darker, lurking in the heart of this twisted reality, and she knew she would have to face it. As if in response to her thoughts, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low rumble that grew in intensity. The floor cracked and split open, revealing a chasm of utter blackness beneath her. From within the depths of the chasm came a sound, a deep guttural growl that reverberated through the air, causing the very walls to shudder. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the abyss, knowing that whatever was down there, it was far worse than anything she had encountered so far. The doppelganger had been just a harbinger, a warning of what was to come. A sharp, bone-chilling wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. The shadows shifted, pulling away from the walls and gathering at the edge of the chasm, swirling in a chaotic dance as they began to coalesce into a form. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the shadows solidify, rising up from the abyss to reveal a towering, grotesque figure. It was a monstrous amalgamation of darkness and despair, its form constantly shifting, as though it could barely contain the sheer malevolence within it. Its eyes, black hollow voids, glowed faintly in the dim light, and its mouth twisted into a sneer, jagged teeth gleaming like knives. The entity towered over Emily, its presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was the source of everything, the dark force that had created the twisted version of her, the malevolent spirit behind the ghost train's curse. It had been waiting for this moment, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every step she took deeper into the nightmare. Now, it was ready to devour her whole. The figure's voice rumbled through the air, a deep, gravelly sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. "You've come far, Emily," it said, the words dripping with mockery. "But you knew from the start that there was no escape. You belong to me now." The voice resonated within her mind, twisting her thoughts, amplifying her deepest fears. She felt the weight of its words pressing down on her, threatening to break her spirit. But something inside her resisted, something stronger than fear. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet the creature's gaze. "No," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I don't belong to you. I never did." The entity's sneer widened, its form shifting and rippling as if agitated by her defiance. The shadows around it flared, reaching toward her like claws, but she stood her ground. The creature laughed, a low guttural sound that sent chills racing down her spine. "You've been mine since the moment you stepped on that train," it hissed. "Your fear is what brought you here, and your fear is what will keep you here. Forever." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Emily like a cold, suffocating fog. They twisted around her limbs, pulling her toward the chasm, where the entity awaited with open arms. She struggled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the darkness was relentless, dragging her closer to the edge. Panic flared in her chest, the primal instinct to flee taking over, but she knew there was no escaping this. The only way out was through. She had to face the entity, not with fear, but with the strength she had found in confronting her past. With a sudden burst of energy, Emily broke free from the shadow's grip, stumbling backward but staying on her feet. The entity growled, its form flickering as though momentarily weakened. It recoiled, its hollow eyes narrowing in anger. "You think you can resist me?" it spat, the air around it crackling with dark energy. "You think you can defy your own fear?" Emily's pulse raced, but this time it wasn't just fear driving her, it was determination. She had spent so long running, so long hiding from the darkness within her, but now, standing on the precipice of the abyss, she realized that fear didn't control her. It never had. The shadows surged again, but this time Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." The entity's form flickered, its monstrous face twisting with rage. "You should be," it hissed, its voice no longer mocking, but furious. The shadows lashed out, but they couldn't touch her, not anymore. The air around her crackled with tension as the entity's power surged, but Emily stood firm. The chasm yawned before her, dark and endless, but Emily took another step closer to the edge. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She had faced the darkness inside her, and now she would face the darkness outside. The entity recoiled again, its form losing its cohesion, the shadows swirling chaotically around it. Emily could feel its rage, its desperation, as it realized that it could no longer control her. "You can't defeat me," it snarled, its voice rising to a deafening roar. "I am everything you fear. I am the darkness inside you. I am your worst nightmare." But Emily only smiled, a small defiant smile. "You're just a part of me," she said softly. "And I'm not afraid of myself anymore." With that, she took the final step forward, and the ground beneath her gave way, the chasm swallowing her whole. But instead of falling into the abyss, she felt herself lift, as if the darkness had lost its grip on her completely. The shadows screamed around her, the entity's roar of fury echoing in her ears, but it couldn't touch her. She was free. The air shimmered, and the world around her began to dissolve, the twisted reality unraveling like a thread being pulled loose. The entity's monstrous form crumbled, its power fading as Emily's resolve grew stronger. And then, with one final desperate howl, it vanished, consumed by the very darkness it had once commanded. Emily found herself standing in silence, the oppressive weight of the nightmare lifted. The room was gone, the shadows gone, and in their place was only light, soft, warm, and welcoming. She took a deep breath, her body trembling from the adrenaline, but her mind at peace. She had faced the darkness, and she had won. Emily stood in the eerie stillness, her heart pounding as the last echoes of the entity's howl faded into the void. The suffocating darkness that had haunted her was gone, replaced by an unnerving silence that filled the space. She was free, or so it seemed. The air was still cold, the shadows still lingered at the edges of her vision, and something about the quiet felt wrong, too empty, too quiet. Emily took a deep breath, the relief that had initially flooded her mind now tainted with a sense of unease. She knew the battle had ended, but the terror didn't leave her. It clung to her like an invisible presence, whispering that this nightmare wasn't entirely over. The world around her began to shift, the room warping once again as the walls bent inward, dissolving into a mist. Slowly, the familiar surroundings of the ghost train re-emerged: wooden seats, faded wallpaper, and the low hum of the train's engine. The train was moving again, rattling along the tracks as if nothing had happened, as if she had imagined the entire ordeal. The soft, rhythmic clatter of wheels against the iron rails filled the air. Emily blinked, disoriented, her hands gripping the worn leather of her seat. The other passengers, who had been frozen in eerie stillness throughout her journey, were now stirring, talking, laughing, oblivious to the horrors she had just endured. Was it really over? She glanced around, searching for any sign of the entity, any lingering trace of the shadows that had nearly consumed her. The train car looked normal, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The memories of the monstrous doppelganger, the twisted reflection of herself, and the shadowy entity's final roar were still fresh in her mind. It was impossible to believe that it had simply ended like this, as if she could return to the world unchanged after everything she had faced. Then she noticed it, a flicker in the corner of her vision. A shadow, brief but unmistakable, darting across the window beside her. Her breath hitched. Emily turned her head slowly, her pulse quickening, but when she looked out the window, all she saw was darkness, the landscape rushing by in a blur of night. Yet the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her sight, grew stronger. Her skin prickled, and the knot of fear in her stomach tightened once more. She wasn't alone. The train's lights flickered just for a moment, and in that brief instant, Emily saw something reflected in the glass. A face, pale and gaunt, staring back at her. It was gone as soon as the light steadied, but it was enough to send a cold wave of terror through her. She clenched her jaw, her mind racing. Hadn't she defeated the entity? Hadn't she escaped the nightmare? But the reflection had been clear, a fleeting glimpse of something that should not have been there. Her own face, twisted with fear, or perhaps something else, something still lurking within her. The train's rattling grew louder, more unsettling, as if the very tracks beneath it were shifting, groaning under the weight of something unseen. The passengers around her continued talking, unaware of the subtle changes in the atmosphere, the thickening of the air, the slight dimming of the lights. Emily's hands trembled as she ran them through her hair, trying to calm herself. It couldn't be real, she told herself. She had won. She had faced her darkest fears, confronted the malevolent force, and survived. But doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind, relentless and insidious. Then, a sound broke through the uneasy quiet, a low whisper, just behind her ear. "You can't escape me." The voice was soft, almost playful, but filled with a cold, cruel intent. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, she turned, but there was no one there. The seat behind her was empty, but the air felt colder, thick with an invisible presence. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. It was a trick, a remnant of the fear she had faced. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The entity hadn't been destroyed, it had only been momentarily banished. Its presence still lingered, watching, waiting. The lights flickered again, and this time, they stayed off longer, just long enough for Emily to hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the far end of the carriage. Her breath quickened, her eyes darting toward the noise, but when the lights came back on, the aisle was empty. The passengers continued their conversations as if nothing had happened, but the dread gnawing at Emily's mind grew stronger. The whispers were getting louder, filling the space around her, crawling into her thoughts. "You can't run forever, Emily," the voice whispered again, its tone mocking, almost amused. "I'm always with you." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it was useless. The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of her vision, and the air felt heavier, darker. The entity hadn't been defeated. It had taken root inside her, lurking in the recesses of her mind, waiting for the moment when her defenses were down. She had survived the ghost train, but something had followed her back. Emily's hands shook as she pressed them to her temples, her thoughts swirling in chaos. She had fought so hard, confronted her fears, but the terror hadn't left her. It had embedded itself deep inside her, a part of her that could never truly be eradicated. The sense of dread that filled the train car was unbearable now, suffocating her as the shadows danced at the edges of her vision, taunting her with the knowledge that the nightmare would never really end. The train slowed as it approached its final stop, the wheels screeching against the tracks. The other passengers gathered their belongings, laughing and chatting as though they hadn't been through the same journey, as if they hadn't felt the darkness Emily had. She stood shakily, her legs unsteady as she made her way toward the exit. But as she stepped off the train and into the cold night air, the voice whispered one last time, faint but undeniable. "I'll be waiting, Emily. Always." She looked back at the train, now shrouded in mist, and for a brief moment she saw it, the shadow of the entity standing at the far window, watching her with hollow black eyes. A chill ran down her spine, and she knew with a sinking certainty that the terror wasn't over. It would never truly be over. The darkness would follow her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she least expected it. The ghost train was gone, but its curse remained. As Emily walked away, the cold night wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of a laugh, soft, sinister, and filled with the promise of a terror that would never die.